Algeria has bid farewell to its days under President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's government. This man led Algeria for almost 20 years. Folks, his last days, they were pretty crazy. Something like a cross between fantasy fiction and an ancient myth. On the one hand, we've got this guy, Bouteflika, who cannot communicate efficiently and who resembles the decrepit King Theoden from Lord of the Rings, a ruler puppeteered by his advisors. On the other hand, we've got a kind of Algerian version of El Cid Campeador, absolutely incapacitated Bouteflika, surrounded by his acolytes who hoped to stick him into a wheelchair and wheel him into his 5th presidential term. But hold on a second, because maybe you don't know who El Cid Campeador is. Well, I'm talking about the legendary Spanish historical character that Charlton Heston played in the 1961 movie El Cid.
Your colors are no longer black.
Until my father is avenged, my colors will be deepest black.
I'm gonna leave a link in the description below to that if you want to read a bit more on the subject. The fact is that this was the last straw, and it kicked off a chain of events. Bouteflika, he wouldn't have a 5th term. But folks, to be honest, that's the least of it. Thinking that there's democracy in Algeria is sort of like thinking that Nicolas Maduro won the last elections in Venezuela all fair and square.
Venezuela tiene una democracia sólida. Creo que es la democracia más sólida, más completa y más libre de todo el continente americano.
Algeria is a democracy in name, but it's not an effective democracy. What they do have, though, is a lot of questions on the table. What has Bouteflika meant for Algeria's history? What will happen when he leaves? And are we about to witness a new chapter of the Arab Spring? Well, today in VisualPolitik, we are going to answer all of these questions, but first, a bit of history.
The origin.
We only need to take a look at Algeria's most recent history to understand the enormous power that the army has always had in this country. In the last 60 years, Algeria has undergone a liberation war against the French, a military dictatorship that ran for more than 2 decades, and a 10-year civil war. In other words, in the last 60 years, the Algerian army has been a key player in most current affairs and most national politics. But basically, if he hadn't resigned, April the 27th, 2019 would have marked the 20th anniversary since the army handed over power to Bouteflika. In that time, he was considered the consensual president of Algeria. 2 decades later, many people think that this was Algeria's most stable period, and that over those decades it became one of the safest countries in the Arab world. However, many analysts think that this is due to stagnation rather than stability. But hold on a second, because before we continue, I think we should answer a fundamental question. Just who is Abdelaziz Bouteflika? Well, dear viewer, our protagonist was born 82 years ago in Oujda, a Moroccan city near the border with Algeria. His parents were Algerians, and at the age of 19, he decided to join the National Liberation Army to fight the French. During the war, his career skyrocketed, and he soon became part of Colonel Houari Boumedienne's inner circle, who was the main head of state. That is how, once the country's independence was achieved in 1962, Bouteflika was already a minister, even though he was only 25 years old. And shortly after that, when Boumedienne himself, then Minister of Defense, engineered a coup d'etat, taking a step towards the military dictatorship, our protagonist played a very, very important role. You see, Houari Boumedienne was president of Algeria until his death in 1978, and at his side was Bouteflika, who was Algeria's foreign minister during the entire dictatorship. But of course, after Boumedienne's death, Bouteflika suffered the fate of many people who collaborate or are a part of a dictatorship. He fell into disgrace. He was accused of and condemned of corruption, and his public image, it was absolutely in tatters, so he moved to Europe. Of course, it didn't take long until he returned to a very troubled Algeria. At that time, and we're talking about the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s here, the Algerian Revolution, it was trying to leave behind a single-party regime and become an authentic democracy once and for all. It was precisely in this context, in 1991, that the first open parliamentary elections were held. In the first round, the Islamist party won by a landslide. The second round, it didn't even happen. The army annulled all votes before the Islamists could achieve a sufficient majority to change the constitution and turn Algeria into a new Iran. Then Algeria began a civil war against Islamism. The result? 200,000 deaths inside of a decade.
Le pouvoir.
It was then, after the civil war, that Bouteflika's time, it really came. See, in 1999, the then military president Lamine Zeroual unexpectedly resigned and called for presidential elections. But the army didn't want free elections. They saw Bouteflika as the right person to lead Algeria towards national reconciliation, and as it was said, so it was done, nothing else was needed. And, well, basically, Bouteflika's government managed to end the civil war. He managed to act with a steady hand, even at the worst of moments. And not only that, Bouteflika opened the country's economy to foreign investment. This made it possible for gas and oil revenues to sustain the government's social policies. Since then, folks, Algeria has become a kind of rentier country. They took the income from their oil and gas industry for granted and depended heavily on that money to run the country. A large part of the population quickly became accustomed to subsidies and to the fact that basically all products were heavily subsidized. All of this allowed Bouteflika to maintain his popular support without having to take a single step towards the country's effective democratization.
ديونهم التي بالغت آنذاك 14 مليار دينار.
Since Bouteflika's rise to power, that power, it was concentrated increasingly in the presidential palace. This became so extreme that political institutions ceased to have any value in practice. Bouteflika, he was the power. The concentration of power was so great that when the leader suffered a stroke in 2013, nobody could see an alternative. There was no plan B. All the plans for Algeria's future included Bouteflika as the country's political leader. What happens is that this stroke led to one of the most surreal scenarios ever seen in a country's politics. Bouteflika was left in a wheelchair, practically unable to speak and completely dependent on others. Obviously, the president couldn't govern under these conditions. However, when presidential elections were held in 2014, nobody thought of an alternative. Even though the president couldn't even address the population during the entire election campaign, he still won the elections. Now, don't be surprised though, Algerian democracy is a bit like that. The results are determined even before the votes are cast. And so now you might be wondering, well, if the old leader's not doing it, who exactly is ruling Algeria? And this is precisely where le pouvoir comes in. See, pouvoir is a French word that means power. So the power, or le pouvoir as they say in Algeria, is an expression that refers to the elites that have dominated the Algerian Republic since the country's independence. These are political, economic, and military elites that have been unable to agree on a new president for the last 6 years. So yeah, you could probably see how Algerian democracy really works. In any case, not being able to agree on a candidate wasn't something that really worried these elites. After all, they had Bouteflika to maintain their privileges and control over the country. However, this time, they made a mistake.
The limit.
Since 2014, the drop in oil and natural gas prices has been a major blow to the Algerian economy. The country's income decreased by 50%, and don't forget that more than half of the Algerian budget is financed by hydrocarbon exports. Basically, the books became so wildly unbalanced that extreme measures were taken, such as this.
Algeria bans imports of cell phones, furniture, food to curb trade deficit.
And of course, in addition to these prohibitions, many other goods were taxed with very high tariffs. Because of course, when a rentier country loses income, well, how can they pay the bills? And the reality is, they can't. So those subsidies, they had to get cut.
Algerian lawmakers approve budget calling for hikes in fuel prices, taxes.
With the loss of income from the drop in oil and gas prices, Algeria's situation became critical. You see, despite the government cutting spending by 10% per year, the public deficit reached an alarming level, 12% of the GDP. And of course, being unable to finance many of the subsidies that the government used to distribute, the cost of living in Algeria has skyrocketed in the last 5 years. And I think you can probably now understand the huge social discontent that's going on in Algeria.
Algeria. Soaring food prices fuel popular resentment.
And as if this wasn't enough, Algeria has a very young population. The average age is under 30. The combination of a lot of young people and economic stagnation can be lethal for this type of regime. Why is that? Because if a country is stuck or in a crisis, it can't create opportunities for the young people, and they have the strength and vitality to take to the streets. And, well, that's precisely what happened. For young Algerians, there was no other way to end the regime led by the mummy, as Bouteflika is popularly known. They aimed to end a dictatorial and very corrupt regime that has condemned the country to chronic stagnation, turning it into a country that has had to get used to news like this.
East-West Highway, $5 billion of corruption.
That is why, when on February the 10th, the regime announced Bouteflika's candidacy for a 5th term in elections that would of course be rigged, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. 6 days later, on February the 16th, 2019, mobilizations against this candidacy and against the regime began. Little by little, the protests spread throughout the country. We're talking about the biggest mobilization that Algeria has experienced since 1999. And they had incredible success. Just 6 weeks after the protests began, Bouteflika was forced to resign and leave power. But of course, this doesn't mean that the problems are over for Algeria, not at all. We still need to see if the elites will accept open elections without pouting, if the opposition can get organized and prepare a solid candidacy, and if the results of this process will actually lead to an effective political transition. Meanwhile, the country's economy continues to have many problems. To balance the budget, the Maghrebi country needs to set the oil price at over $99. Current price? Well, it's under $75. And that's not all. You see, one of the country's future challenges is decreasing their dependence on hydrocarbons. But first, Algeria needs to liberalize its economy and favor the arrival of more foreign investment in the hydrocarbon sector in order to avoid production forecasts from not being met. Folks, Algeria is one of the largest energy producers in Africa, and it's a key natural gas supplier to Europe. But if there's no investment, production will fall. And evidently, a fall in production due to not having invested enough would seriously aggravate their country's economic problems. Here at VisualPolitik, we've already seen this happen in Venezuela, for example, because the investments that the oil sector needed, they were not made. You want to learn more about that? We tell you all about it in this video. Now, Algeria is not Venezuela, that's obvious, but international companies complain about the tremendous bureaucracy, the incredible uncertainty, and also all the corruption that plagues the country. As you can see, the challenge that Algeria faces in the post-Bouteflika era is enormous. So what will happen to the country from now on? Will the country achieve its much-needed political and economic transition, or will the elites of the Bouteflika era maintain their power and control by putting another president they trust in to lead the country? Well, that remains to be seen, and we'll keep you updated about it. In any case, in a few years, we hope that Algeria will resemble Tunisia more than it does Egypt. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you next time.